Teams call and real people in front of me, not just little faces, or the stadium view, which is even weirder. If you've ever done it. So it's really nice to be out for the first time in almost 2 years, doing something live and seeing friends, Colin and Kim and Zach and many others. So thank you first for them for inviting me to be a speaker. It's always great to get out and speak publicly. Colleen indicated I've been doing this a long time. I spent most of my career on the clinical side, and then in 2004 I moved to the dark side. Actually, I've been involved in that side ever since. In a few different companies. I was part of Inogen, the startup in the first 3 years of the company, and then I spent the next 7.5 years in Medicare running their respiratory product business. And I left there and had an opportunity to join Drive Medical as they were acquiring Bill's Healthcare, helped take over and run Bill's Healthcare, and then took out the responsibility. So transition to part-time means I'm trying to retire and they wouldn't let me. So I just transitioned over. I was into this role where I'm in more part-time capacity and still working on new product development, R&D, regulatory quality field areas. So it's a real pleasure to be here. How many of you work in home care? Just out of curiosity. So handful of you and the rest of you, great. How many of you are involved in the transition of patients on oxygen? Unfortunately, that's the usual number. There are almost no respiratory therapists involved in the transition of patients on oxygen anymore. Many years ago, I started doing that lecture that everybody's hand was raised because the RTs did the discharges for respiratory patients, but that's long since changed. So, I don't really have much disclosure other than I do work for a manufacturer, but I don't think that has any conflict. And same with my role at the ARCF. So just some background. I mean, most of the time we're talking about home oxygen therapy outside of the pandemic. We were really talking about disproportionately COPD patients transitioning to home oxygen. They make up the largest percentage of the population on home oxygen. And then smaller subsets are all of the other respiratory conditions, fibrotic lung diseases, cancer patients, lung cancer, some occasionally pulmonary hypertension patients, but disproportionately, pre-COVID, the vast majority is COPD, and COPD gets a lot of attention because of its importance as a diagnosis in the United States. So I'm not going to burn a lot of calories here, telling you guys a lot of stuff about COPD. I typically start these conversations so we get a kind of get a baseline of who we're talking about when we're talking about using home oxygen therapy and the importance of it. So, COPD hasn't gone away. We've stopped talking about every other disease except COVID-19 for the last 18 months or 20 months, but many of those patients with COVID were also patients with COPD who had pulmonary complications involved with their infections. For those of you who work in the inpatient setting, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. You've been dealing with it. So obviously this population is more predisposed in some cases for more severe illness and pulmonary complications as part of that infection. So COPD still stay hanging up there at the top. It covers between the third and fourth leading cause of death worldwide in the United States. It's a similar problem worldwide. So we're a global company. And we see the same issues globally as COPD. It's getting a lot of attention. In the US, where we are specifically, it's still a very expensive disease. The patients make up a large portion of the population. You can see the cost, direct and indirect costs that COPD costs us as a country each year. There's some interesting trends we'll see in the data, and it doesn't seem to line up exactly with where the COPD population is going. So normally you would expect as COPD goes up, oxygen would go up concurrently, but there's been some changes, and at least the way the data is presenting now, we're not seeing that. So it might make a comeback. There's some things going on, but I'll give you at least my interpretation of the data and what I think that means and why, and then kind of where I think it's going to be heading. So just one last slide. I think I'm just on COPD. Again, not telling you anything that you don't know, but it's interesting. I was talking with my wife on the drive down. My wife also worked in healthcare for the last 30-something years. We were talking about the amount of money spent on different diagnosed on different diseases as far from research, and she did a lot of work with HIV and AIDS. And HIV and AIDS, which now actually is a very, very small proportion of the population. If you've ever looked at the NIH, the amount of money spent in research, it's exponentially more money than spent. COPD is like at the bottom of the pile. It gets very, very, very little research money from in comparison to some diseases, particularly like HIV. And the payout has been good for HIV. As you see, these new antiviral drugs, they have basically no infection once they're treated. They can't detect the virus, and they can't transmit the virus. So I guess if you spend enough money on anything, you can find a way to a cure. We don't spend that much money on COPD for some reason, and there's lots of discussion about that, but it hasn't moved, and it seems to be moving in the wrong direction. Since I haven't been able to defy the laws of physics and chemistry, we haven't gotten there yet. But they are a population that are very, very difficult. I think there's a whole thing going right on the AERC Connect about high flow patients and treating them, and nobody wants to take them. There's no liquid oxygen out there and stuff. So while they are a small subset, they are a very important subset because they're a challenge both in the inpatient setting, but in particular in the outpatient home care setting. And then more recently, COVID, which has had an impact on everything we do. So I'm in the oxygen business. This is one of probably the top 2 or 3 manufacturers of oxygen concentrators in the United States, particularly stationary, the 5-liter and the 10-liter concentrators. And I can tell you that when March of 2020 came, we saw the most unprecedented demand for oxygen concentrators I've seen since I made my way to the dark side. And it hasn't stopped. We're still seeing demand, because if it slows down in one market, it picks up in another. It's a global organization. In fact, globally, on a worldwide basis, there's an incredible amount of attention being paid to oxygen outside of the U.S. We are fortunate to be in one of the most sophisticated healthcare markets in the world, if not the most sophisticated healthcare market in the world. I don't pay much attention to politics, and I don't watch the news anymore, but no matter what they tell you, we have the most sophisticated, most technologically complex, and the best care you can get in the world. I sit on a panel with the World Health Organization in a group called Every Breath Counts Coalition. It's a coalition made up of probably 100 different organizations worldwide, includes ministers of health in many countries. And right now we meet every week. We've been meeting every week for months now on the COVID issues. And the Gates Foundation is involved. There's all kinds of what they call NGOs, non-governmental organizations, basically big rich foundations that pay for things like UNICEF and the Gates Foundation and things like that. And there's a big light being shined on oxygen therapy and respiratory therapy globally. Again, we're the most mature market in the United States for oxygen. We're the most mature market really for kind of well, we develop respiratory therapy here. It's not by the way, if you don't know this, we don't exist in most of the world. You know, when you leave pretty much the US and Canada, there really aren't respiratory therapists. We have some spots of people that trained here and took some ideas back to different countries like the Middle East and a little bit in South Korea. But for the most part, respiratory therapy isn't practiced outside of North America. It's a profession that started here and really hasn't expanded. Now, there are people who do it. They have pulmonary nurses. They have what they call physiotherapists that like physical therapists that are focused on pulmonary medicine. So there are people engaged. But again, those are even in the more mature countries, like the Western European countries. So when you get out of Western Europe, North America, a little bit of South America, we don't exist. And when you get into what are now referred to as either low resource countries or low to middle income countries, LMICs, you'll hear that term in the news. The primary caregivers for respiratory are usually a physician, and in some cases maybe a nurse. And the amount of training the average international physician has in pulmonary medicine is equal to your first semester in respiratory therapy school. So it is, I sit on these calls and I listen to and it's incredibly sad. And there's been a movement going on, just as a side note on oxygen, there's been a movement going on for years that with UNICEF and the Gates Foundation, a few other organizations, because they're trying to get oxygen into some of these low resource countries. And I'm talking about small countries within Africa, small countries within China, or small regions within China, countries in Pakistan, Middle East, Southeast, parts of South America, where the infants die of simple pneumonia. And infants and small children die of simple pneumonia. And really they could survive if they just had supplemental oxygen while they were working through the illness, since it's typically viral. So huge movements to try to get infrastructure. Most of these countries don't have the infrastructure. Piped oxygen is a fantasy. Many use giant concentrators. Pressure swing absorption systems actually are what makes the oxygen for the hospitals, not just for the patients in the home. So COVID is, if it's done anything good, at least from where I sit here at the end of my career, is it's shined a light on this global problem, and really the lack of understanding and knowledge of how the management of patients, the technical side of respiratory and pulmonary medicine, where we spend most of our time as technical technologists, and of course the clinical, and then obviously the infrastructure and the things that support that. But just on COVID, COVID's probably going to have an impact on oxygen therapy forever, in great part because during this, Medicare had opened up the national coverage determination, what's called the NCD. It wasn't initially for COVID, it was being looked at for some other things, but they rarely do that. They haven't opened up this policy in over 30 years. And these are the policies that determine how oxygen is paid for in the home. And while it's still fairly ambiguous now, maybe Kim will know more than I do, it's still fairly ambiguous at the moment. They've made a couple of interesting language changes at least in the draft communication that was put out around eliminating the need for the chronic stable state, which is language that has existed in the coverage policy since the 1970s, early 1980s, when the research from the KNOT study and the BMRC study in Europe laid the framework for covering home oxygen. And that framework was basically really, really bad COPD patients who have a PaO2 below 55 or less. And we didn't have pulse oxes back in those days. For those of you who remember world without pulse oximetry like I do. So we didn't really rely on saturation very much as we do today. But that whole criteria was set up around COPD patients who were at their best baseline they were going to be before they got discharged from the hospital. And that was considered a chronic stable state. So you're chronically hypoxemic, on your best day, you ain't getting any better. And that's how we decided who gets to go home on oxygen. Well, that doesn't really work very well when you work with infants. It doesn't really work very well in a pandemic when you have a lot of people that could get out of the bed if they could get oxygen at home, but they don't have a chronic condition and they're not in a chronic stable state. They're in acute or semi-acute state. So the language changes that are going to come from this probably will have a positive influence. Because I think one of the good things that will happen, and I'll get off my thing and get you to the data, is those of us who've been campaigning for home care, Kim has been one, and probably Zach has been one, and above Zach, when Zach was still in preschool, Gene, Gene is dad. We have been campaigning to get attention around home care and home respiratory care in particular, and the role we play and the importance we play in transitioning patients out of acute care settings. Has anyone ever been a patient in a hospital? It's the worst experience of your life. You do not want to be a patient in a hospital. And if you're chronic and you got to spend time there, or worse, long-term care, if you've transitioned there for a period of your time as in your healing process, you'd much rather be treated at home if you can. But we got all these silly rules and regulations that were written in the 1960s and early 1970s that really dictate how that happens. And because of that, we have this antiquated system that doesn't recognize the role of transitioning low acuity patients out, treat those patients at home, clear those beds out. It's a much lower cost of care, and you free up those burned out clinical staff right now that are getting crushed in the hospitals because of the high censuses. So that may come from this. Hopefully we'll see a better recognition that we can move. And that's one of the things that was in the commentary of the NCD. I don't know if you read it, Kim, and you saw it as well, but the first time I ever saw empathy and compassion in a government document, ever. And I did government affairs for a part of my career, and I spent a fair amount of time in Washington, which is why I won't do it again. But it's the first time I saw empathy and compassion in a policy. So a couple of things here that have played out that could give us some of that. So obviously oxygen has become an incredibly important part of treating COVID. Ventilation didn't work out so well for us, at least the first approach that we took, treating them like ARDS patients. And now we've kind of got it down, I think, a lot better for most patients. But high flow nasal cannula and O2 with NIV have become kind of the standards of treatment. The problem is getting those out. For example, high flow nasal cannula is not covered at home yet. And I talked to the DME MAC medical directors, and they're not feeling warm and fuzzy about making a HCPCS code for it. So, that there's going to be some work that has to happen still around that. But we're seeing kind of the stress point. The same thing's happening in home that's happening in the hospital. The DME companies are stressed to the end. They can't hire people. It's the volume of patients that are being asked to take is the highest they've ever had. The size of their geographic territories has gotten larger than they've had. They're expanding, trying to get people home, which are in long-term great things. Short-term it's problematic when you have the resources. But I do think that this may create some opportunity for using oxygen more like we use it in acute care settings in the home, where we use it as a limited therapy, where we have a plan to get you off, get you weaned, as opposed to just this chronic stable state where you go home and on your best sunny day, you're not going to have a PA, which is about 55. So, and they've also been very, very liberal at prescribing, which has also been part of the reason I believe that there are so many more oxygen patients coming out of the hospital in this particular diagnosis than anything we've ever seen, even in really bad flu seasons like H1N1. Which we typically see a lot of the same kind of patterns, just not to the magnitude that we saw here. Because they're treating them very liberally, meaning if you heard the term silent hypoxia, it's something that kind of came out. It's in the literature around COVID. These are why they couldn't understand these patients coming in the emergency room and still talking, and their PO2s were in the 70s. They didn't act like a regular hypoxemic, hypercapnic patient. So they've been sending these folks home on saturations that we would often consider normal. 93, 92, 93 is a lot of cutoffs from the literature I've read and the docs I've talked to in some of these facilities that are doing it. And this is just one protocol I stole. Again, you can see it's fairly liberal in the saturation, which direction they're going to go. And just some of the approaches towards how they are classifying these patients, which is the reason I bring it up and point it out, is it's so dramatically different from everything I've done for the last, near 38 years, where we've been dealing mostly around this chronic stable population and COPD and very narrow subsets. Because of the pandemic, we're being more creative and more intelligent about our approach. So now I'll get into the data, the more interesting or boring, depending on if you like stats and data. So how many people are on oxygen in the home in the United States? Anybody have an idea? Lots. Yeah. Well, the answer to that is we don't exactly know, because there's no singular way to count them all. And it's a highly dynamic population. Every day there's people going on oxygen, and every day there are people getting discharged off oxygen, either because they no longer need it or they found their way to the other side. And they've since passed away, which is the number one reason chronic patients come off oxygen. And so what we rely on is the one kind of source that we do have access to that is, I would say, relatively accurate. I won't say it's 100% accurate, but it's as accurate as the data set that we're going to get. So Medicare publishes a lot of information. If you're ever really bored, if you're in grad school and you're doing a research project or something like that, if you go to cms.gov and go into their research and statistics little selection up on their website, you can dive into all kinds. They got to be spending millions and millions of government dollars creating pie charts and Excel spreadsheets and tables and PowerPoint presentations about all the things that go on in the government. So it's a wealth of information. But what we rely on, and I've been following this for a long time, and I have a data set from 2004 through 2020 that I use to kind of monitor the market. This comes from the traditional Medicare population, so the fee-for-service, because that's the only one that's publicly reported, the only data that's publicly reported about utilization. But they don't give you like granular level detail, and you could try it through a FOIA report, a Freedom of Information Act request. But after spending lots and lots of money and going back and forth with the government on a FOIA request, you'll usually get a giant data file that doesn't give you exactly what you want. It takes 5 IT guys to get through the data file and sort it out, things like that. So it's not nearly as simple as it always sounds. So a couple things that we have to account for when we look at the Medicare data. It doesn't include Medicare Advantage. So Medicare Advantage has become, everybody familiar with Medicare Advantage? That's the Medicare HMOs. I'm getting very familiar with them as I'm planning out my future. And help, a lot of my older in-laws select their Medicare policies as they've aged over. And so, the Medicare Advantage has become increasingly popular, particularly as this group of the baby boomers, I'm the last or second last year of the baby boom, I think, which I found out boomer is now an insult. You can get called a boomer, meaning you're old thinking, I guess. Don't know, but it's just a thought on that. So anyhow, there's a couple things you have to account for. Medicare Advantage now is close to 40% of Medicare beneficiaries are in a Medicare Advantage program. So that's a big chunk of data missing from the Medicare fee-for-service data set. The other is we screwed up the data set in 2009 when we created the 36-month cap on oxygen. So if you're not familiar with how oxygen companies get paid, Medicare, in their infinite wisdom of saving money, and if you want to talk about saving money, I'm going to talk this afternoon about silver bullets in healthcare, where I talk about all the things that sounded good on paper, but were really about not paying. They decided that if a patient stays on oxygen in the home for 36 consecutive months, that they've paid enough to that DME company. So they made it a capped rental, which is kind of a silly term because, that's like if you're successful to go out to a car dealership and negotiate a lease where you pay the 3-year, 36-month lease, but then after the 36-month lease, if you still want to drive the car, you get to drive it for free for at least 2 more years before you have to pay them again. That's exactly what the 36-month cap rental is. So if a patient stays on oxygen for 36 consecutive months, Medicare stops paying the DME company for the equipment. And you still have to service that patient as if you're getting paid. Now, there's some small fees you can get for portable gas refills, but it doesn't cover the cost of the service required to maintain that patient. Also, all the consumables and accessories that they use, the cannulas, tubings, and so on, are free to them because they were considered prepaid over the 36-month period. Well, that may have sounded interesting when home care companies were getting paid close to $300 a month for oxygen. But when you're getting paid $75 a month for a stationary concentrator over 3 years, it's a very different animal. And and you know, there are some places where it's as low as that. So what happened is they did an analysis, and at 36-month point, we lose about 20% of those patients, plus or minus about 5%. I think that I'll show you right out of the OIG report. It was 22% at the time they did the study. I think that was 2006. And so those patients are still there. They're still at home on oxygen. We just can't see them in the data anymore. They come off the data set. So you have to account for them. They're there, they're real, they're getting oxygen, they're using stuff, they're getting taken care of, but they don't show up in any database. And then after that, I have done freedom of information requests over the course of my career with Medicaids and tried to get a large enough sample size from the Medicaid programs to be able to extrapolate what the Medicaid oxygen population looks like. But they're not all the same. If you've seen one state Medicaid, you've seen one state Medicaid. They don't all operate exactly the same. And so while they're similar, they have different coverage rules, and obviously the populations are very different. You go to a very rural state, the Medicaid numbers look very different when you go to a very urban state. You know, so what you see in New York is not what you see in Idaho. So you can't even kind of do it as a percentage of. It's very, very difficult. So can't really get the good Medicaid data, and now Medicaid's mostly HMO. So now you got to deal with private companies. It's all privatized, so you don't get any data. So you kind of got to guess at something. And then how long is the patient on oxygen? If you ask the average person, and I have, everyone says 2 years or 3 years. That's usually their most common answer. And it might be a reasonable representation, but the problem is that it moves in real time, and Medicare doesn't really count the ins and outs as much. They just count the number of approved claims in any given period. So you kind of got to back into the number. So a lot of my assumptions here are based on how the data is given to you and how to interpret that data. So this is from the OIG report that was published in 2006. The OIG did a look into the Medicare oxygen claims data for Medicare to understand what the liability was going to be after the 36-month cap, like how many patients would be out there when they capped and what their liability would be, and then what was the probability that those patients were going to make it to the 50th month, or I'm sorry, the 60th month, which then is a restart. You get to start billing again if they make it 5 years. So you can see what's interesting about this isn't so much the, this is not, either I don't have, I may not have it on, but what's interesting about this is in the front part of the curve, it's very, very steep decline. So the majority of people who start on oxygen don't stay on oxygen very long. And that was something that was surprising to me, because I was in the home care business and I never knew how long my average patient stayed on, because we didn't count it. It wasn't a really important number. The number that was important to me when I was a provider was how many people do I have to treat this month, how much equipment do I have to buy, how many deliveries do I have to do, and not so much the details around why I was doing all those deliveries and stuff like that. I didn't wise up until much later. And so you can see the curve is very steep. So Rob Chapman and I, a colleague and I, we did this for a purpose of another study, but we took their data and just extrapolated it out, and we actually took it all the way out to 5 years to try to project. But what's interesting is the median length of stay is about 10.5 months. So that means 50%. It's not the average. So the average is skewed because you have patients that stay on for 3 years, a much smaller subset, as you can see towards the end there. So the median, so half the people that you send home on oxygen from your hospital today will be off before the 10th month, basically, or the 11th month. As you can see, it's pretty steep. You know, you're at 60% of them are off pretty quickly, within 6 months. So there's either the patients aren't, one of the things I've learned about COPD and about particularly COPD oxygen patients is they're not homogeneous. They're very heterogeneous. They're very different. One COPD patient who has different comorbidities and is on a particular prescription is different than the guy across the street who's on oxygen. And that guy might go home, might be discharged off his oxygen in 3 months because he got back to a healthy baseline, he was exercising, his congestive heart failure is not nearly as bad as the guy on the other side of the street. So they're not identical. So there's a lot of diversity among the population. So if you've been in the home care business, you know, you've picked up stuff 2 weeks after you delivered it and 10 years after you delivered it. Both of them are kind of the extreme, but that's how we kind of understand the churn or what goes on. I use this data on the other side when I got to the manufacturing side to help predict demand. Like how much, you know, we know how long a concentrator should last, you know, we know how many patients come out of hospitals, and try to predict, you know, how much equipment we're going to need to make in a given period. So these are the HIPPIC codes that describe the oxygen. So this is how we track it. So, you know, I looked into these data, and E1390 is kind of the bullseye because it's the stationary oxygen concentrator. So it is the benchmark for home oxygen equipment. It tells us who's on oxygen because nobody really gets a portable only. And there is a subset that do get a stationary only, but don't get portables. So these data, the E1390 is the benchmark of being able to kind of understand the oxygen patient population in the home. E4039, which you rarely see anymore, is the liquid stationary. E431 is the, you know, you can see I'm not going to read them all. Just to explain, KO738, what the government calls oxygen generating portable equipment, are the home transfilling devices, like the Invacare home fill, excuse me, the DeVilbiss iFill. Philips used to have a product, but I think they discontinued here in the United States. So these are devices that use oxygen from a concentrator to transfill a small cylinder. So it's like delivering a cow to the house, and they fill their own milk bottles, and that's basically what it does. It's revolutionary because it was the first real, what we call non-delivery system, meaning you're not having to deliver the refills, whether it's liquid or cylinders. And as oxygen reimbursement is going down, the biggest cost to most home care companies is the whole logistics around delivery. Picking up, cleaning, taking back, refilling, all of those activities you don't get paid for. It's all part of the few dollars a month they're giving you for your portable. So eliminating a lot of those non-value-added activities is what these devices were intended to do. We also kind of laid the framework for the next big step, which was E1392, the portable oxygen concentrators, which is probably what you hear more about now than any other oxygen device, because the patients see them. There's direct-to-consumer advertising. There's companies that advertise directly to the consumer on television and radio and print. And if you're old enough like me to get AARP magazines and all that stuff, they got full-page ads in there, and they're going after a target demographic. So the POC, which really, you know, Dr. Petty, if those of you who don't know who Thomas Petty is, Dr. Petty's kind of the father or the grandfather at this point of home oxygen therapy. He was one of the key authors, investigators in the KNOT study. It was done in the late 1970s. And he was the biggest champion for changing the reimbursement and paying for home oxygen for patients with COPD. And we've had a number of conferences over the years that I was fortunate to be invited to, where we talked about, they were called the long-term oxygen therapy consensus conferences. There were 6 of them. And each year, and these dated back really into the 80s, each year he would say, I want to see a concentrator that you can carry over your shoulder. So from the time he started saying that until the time we got there, it was about 30 years, but or somewhere plus or minus, but that wasn't because we weren't trying. It was just waiting for the technology to get us there. And that's kind of what happened. So the POCs are important numbers because the portables are divided really between today, there's very little liquid. So E0434 is cylinders, and that's any size cylinders. It can be a D, an M9, an M6, an E cylinder, and then again, the cylinders with the transfer systems. So this is what Medicare stationary oxygen looks like over the course of the period 2004 to 2020. This is the most current data I have. You're always about a year and a half behind with Medicare data. It takes them a while to publish it, and then once you get it, you got to sort through it. But this is what it looks like. And obviously I have the 2009 circle because it's an artificial drop in the population because they disappeared from the radar. So it's like you're watching the radar in 2008, and then in 2009, 22% of the patients just disappeared like a Bermuda Triangle, and that was called cap rental. So they're there, but they're not. And so it artificially looked like 2009 was the year that there were very few people on oxygen in comparison to years around it, but it really wasn't. But what you can see is, again, E1390 and all the stationaries are in this bundle. So it's liquid and the stationary concentrators. And you can see the red line being liquid. That liquid was popular coming out of the early 2000s, and it was the residual of really the 90s when there was a more favorable payment system. We used to get paid for liquid by the pound when I first started in this business. And it evaporated. So you had a patient who was on 2 liters, you put a big vessel out there, the vessel was evaporating 2 liters per minute. And then the patient was getting 2 liters per minute, so they were really using 4 liters per minute. So you're wasting 50% of what was in that. It's not a very efficient way to deliver oxygen. It's great because it's silent. It's great because you put a whole bunch in a little package. But from a purely, if you're totally objective, just looking at what's the best way to provide oxygen out in the home, this would clearly land in last place every time because it's just not efficient. The logistics around it are incredible. I always say, I love riding horses. My wife's had horses. I don't ride a horse to work every day. And there's a reason for that, because it's not a good mode of transportation. And that's my opinion on that. But obviously it's gone down. But you can see there's a clear trend. Now this doesn't include the Medicare Advantage. So it's also underrepresenting the population. And depending on which year, there may have been larger enrollment in Medicare Advantage, and some of those patients may have shifted over. So it does deceive you a little bit. This is the stationary and then the stationary liquid. Again, these are the charges, so you can see how much money they're spending. So if you understand why does the Fed want competitive bidding, why does the Fed want to pay less for technology? Well, you can see in 2008 they paid $2.5 billion for home oxygen, and in 2020 they paid $658 million. That's a massive delta. Now, the number of patients has gone down a little bit, but not proportional to that spend. That's just how much money they have taken out of the system. Now, if you talk to any of the home care providers, are you doing any less than you did for those patients in 2009 or 2008? You're probably doing more because they're more demanding, they're more informed, they have the internet, they watch TV, they see their friends on stuff. So they're a much more demanding population, and you're getting paid a fraction of what you used to get paid. So if I adjust for the cap rental, and basically what I do is I have the, I'm a data nerd, I guess. Some people would say I like the data. I believe math is not an opinion. So if you look at the data tells a story. Politicians, administrators don't always tell a story. So when you look at the data, we have the Medicare enrollment data, thanks to Kaiser Family Foundation publishes this, going back as far back as the Medicare Advantage programs exist. So I match that proportion and make the assumption that the utilization in Medicare Advantage is the same as the utilization within the total Medicare population, apply that math to it, and then I back into that number to account for and make, obviously the DME community and people who make the equipment might view it as bad, but from a population health standpoint, it might not be so bad. So this is the portable. So if you read any of the literature around, there's been a lot of criticism, not really aimed at DME, but they get smacked, unfortunately, indirectly through the data. ATS report, there's a big publication, Jacobs and et al. Wrote this. They did a big survey of COPD patients on oxygen and got all kinds of complaints about the home care providers that were giving them oxygen, and they formed a hypothesis that the providers aren't educating them, the providers aren't giving them what they want, the portable concentrators are not being used properly, people aren't getting what they need, they're still using more cylinders, and at one point the AARC tried to get me on that panel, and they didn't want what do they call us, industry guy. I'm an industry guy. I'm not a clinician. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a researcher. I'm an industry guy. Like, I make widgets. So they wouldn't let me participate, nor would they let anybody else that had the data participate. So I'm actually working on a paper with Rich Branson. And some of you may know Rich Branson. If you read Respiratory Care Journal, he's the editor, where we're going to publish some of these data and a little bit more of a story around it to explain that some of their hypotheses are wrong about what's going on in oxygen. And if you don't look at it from the holistically and at the entire data set, you miss pieces of it. And then, having been in the home care business for a long time myself, I know if you went out and just queried my patients, I know from my own Joint Commission inspection, we handpicked a group of patients and told them, this is what the inspector's going to call you, you're going to get this, you're going to get that. First call, first day, Mr. Smith, who's your home oxygen provider? Invacare, because that was the concentrator I happened to be using at the time. Even though we coached them. Did they show you how to use it? No, nobody came out. They just dropped this thing off on my porch. I had reams of visit documentation and patient education forms and all that stuff. So surveys, not sure it's the best tool in the world to get an accurate reflection. Does it get you data? Yes. Does it get you important data? Sure. Does it get you 100% accurate data? Maybe not so much. And so you can see here, there is a trend. The new technologies clearly have displaced cylinders. And this is something that at least one of the ATS, the papers didn't support. It argued the opposite. It argued that the cylinders were being used way more than the new technologies. But you can see the fastest growing category of product in there are the portable concentrators. And for all good reasons, right? If you're looking at the way to give ideal freedom and opportunity for an oxygen user to have a life, one of the things Dr. Petty used to say about why he wanted a portable concentrator when no such animal existed was the whole purpose when he fought for oxygen for patients in the home, at least he said it a few times, so he's since passed, so you can't go verify that I'm not telling stories about him, but was that he wanted to give them back normalcy. He wanted to allow them to go do the activities that they were able to do and participate in before they decompensated to a point where they needed supplemental oxygen. And to do that, you have to be able to get out. Well, it was hard to get out hauling a steel, which back in the day, steel E-cylinder in a welding cart, which is basically what those are, behind you, while you're trying to do some normal activity, whether it's gardening or golfing or whatever you might be doing. So he wanted to give them some level of normal, sit in church, go to a movie, visit the grandkids, play golf, do all the things that you want to do. And that's really what the portable concentrator allows for. It properly managed and assigned to the appropriate patient with the right titration, it gives them a level of freedom that they will never get with any other technology. We had a patient when I was working at Inogen that we sponsored. He called me. He wanted to try this trip. He was a writer. When he said he was a writer, an old gentleman from Washington State, he was a writer. I thought he was like, wrote for the Church Bulletin or something. No, he wrote for the Washington Post and or Times, and he wrote a book on the Chesapeake Bay, and so he was like a real writer. And he took this train trip across the United States, and then took a boat to Alaska, and then a train back. And he'd done it before, arranging with his home care company to pick up cylinders along the way and drop off cylinders. So he wanted to see if these POCs were the real deal. So when we set him up, he originally wanted like, 30 backup batteries because, he was thinking batteries were like cylinders. And I'm like, no, if you have electricity, you don't need a battery. So he had a diary and he documented his little trip, and it was in the AERC Times some years ago. He wrote a story for it, Traveling Tankless, I think is what it was called. And he basically said, I went across the United States over a 2.5-week period, visited Alaska, was on a cruise ship, and I never ran out of oxygen. And he was able, the device was able to oxygenate him, so it was a good match for him. And that to me is what Petty was trying to get to. And that's why the popularity of the POCs is going up so dramatically. This is just the ratio. When the transfill devices first came out, they were the first, of these non-delivery technologies, so that the demand skyrocketed because the companies that figured it out, Kim was running a company that used them, and lots of companies figured out that you could, when properly employed, they reduced deliveries quite substantially, particularly for patients who had cylinder utilization, and really, if you're covering a large geographic area, those were patients who were most remote. Like, we got to drive, 50 miles in one direction to see one oxygen patient. That's not a very efficient day for your delivery time. And so they changed kind of the dynamic. But as you can see, as the popularity of well, this one is just against traditional cylinders, but much of this is driven by the OGP, the transfill in the beginning and the POCs as you get closer to the end. So one other thing you have to think about is right now in 2020, 99% of all stationary claims are for a concentrator. So around 1% are using liquid at this point in the United States. It's a very, very small percentage. The other thing I've looked at in the data, because it's varied over the years, is the difference between patients who have a stationary and patients who are prescribed a portable. And again, this isn't a perfect match always. You're taking aggregate data and you're making assumptions around aggregate data. But if you look, over the course of my career in doing home care, there was very few patients prescribed nocturnal only. And then there was a huge movement through the late 90s and into the 2000s of overnight testing COPD patients who didn't qualify for oxygen at rest or with exercise, but did demonstrate some desaturation at night. And the US allows for overnight oxygen therapy for patients with nocturnal hypoxemia. We're one of the few countries that do, by the way. Most of the other countries don't. And the reason they don't is there's never been a good study that showed nocturnal only oxygen significantly improves outcomes, whether those outcomes are measured in hospitalizations or mortality. However, when we came out of the NOT study, they felt strongly that there was a trend showing up in the data, but that's never really panned out. So there was a huge movement for a period. And then as the literature changed and the pulmonary physicians changed and the face-to-face documentation changed and certain other things changed, we started to see a trend a little bit away from it. And you can see it in the numbers, right? If you look at the percentage of people with stationary only, in 2012, that was 42%, stayed in the 40s, and now it's back down to 25%. If you go back to 2004, it was 26%. So you can see it kind of rose through the 2000s, and then it kind of fell in the next decade. In the early, the first decade of the 2000, it was rising. In the second decade of the 2000, it's kind of regressed back to where it originally was. And again, there's no clear explanation in the data. It just suggests to us that prescribing practices have changed, and lots of different literature has come out, and different beliefs around treating that subset of patients came forward. Maybe some of those patients were OSA patients, and they moved in that direction and treated them with CPAP as opposed to oxygen. So there's a lot of confounding variables that are hard to confirm. So leading into the big, the drum roll, how big is the market? So if we look at the market and we say, okay, Medicare, Medicaid, Medicare Advantage, how big is the total market? That gives us an idea of how many patients there are. And as I said, Medicare Advantage has grown steadily since I've been monitoring it. So it's almost near 40%. It's projected to be over 40% in 2021. So every year, as the boomers, the younger boomers age, they're more inclined to use an HMO. The older boomers hated HMOs, like most of America hated HMOs in the 70s and most of the 80s. And really into the early 90s, HMOs would, like, especially if you were in industrial cities like the Pittsburghs and the Clevelands, HMOs were not popular among the unions. They were restrictive. Can't see the doctor I want, can't go to the hospital I want, things like that. But for those on the other side of the curve, the boomers that are coming in to the aged population now, we all grew up in HMOs. We didn't have any other kind of insurance but PPO or an HMO. And at least since we've been working adults in many cases. So they offer some advantages that traditional fee-for-service doesn't. You know, 20% plus or minus, you know, some number is about the percentage of patients that stay on oxygen past the 36 months. If you take that number and then you take the number of people that are in the Medicare program and assume the same oxygen utilization, you can predict how many people are on Medicare. So conservatively in the United States, and this is a moving target. So if you picked it in July versus November, you might get a different number. But on an average, in any given month, how many people are being served on home oxygen? Well, with Medicare only, it's about 1.2 million right now. And it probably trends up towards the end of the year. And there's a seasonality to oxygen. And then when you get into the confounding data, how do you determine that? Well, one is what percentage of a home care company's business is Medicare or Medicare Advantage? What's left over is where the rest of their oxygen business is. And so depending on where you're at in the United States, company, their focus, their business, you know, they have different ratios of Medicaid, private insurance. If they're serving the VA, that's a whole other animal, and the math is different there. Hospice, again, another number not tracked. Lengths of stays tend to be very, very short. I had a very large hospice contract for years, and our average length of stay of a hospice patient in our program is 2 weeks. And then, you know, there's a little bit of self-pay in there. So when you're trying to estimate, you know, I believe there are around 2 million, slightly more than 2 million oxygen patients at any given time in the United States. And that number fluctuates, you know, plus or minus probably a couple 100,000 depending on the period, because, you know, there's seasonality associated with it and other elements. So that's about 1 million more than you see in the literature. In almost every scientific paper relies solely on the Medicare data. And that's why if you read the literature, anything or any paper on home care, they'll say there's 1 million oxygen patients. There have been 1 million people on oxygen since I started reading the research. It's never changed in the literature that, you know, because to figure that out beyond Medicare, you have to make certain assumptions. You have to have a knowledge, an in-depth knowledge of how the business works. And most of the researchers don't. You know, they work in hospitals, they work in academia. So that's it. So I'm at the end of my talk here. So what are the big observations? It looks like on paper that the growth of the program has declined modestly since 2011. Don't know exactly why. There's been a significant shift to Medicare Advantage over the years. I kind of explain why I think that's happening. Even when you add back the Medicare Advantage people, unless Medicare Advantage is using it at a higher rate, which I doubt, but just from experience, but I'm only speaking from experience here, and you know, Kim could give you an opinion of Medicare Advantage patients more or less likely to be on oxygen. About the same. Excuse me. So what else has happened? Over the course of this period, there's a lot of things that happened between 2004 and 2020. Regulations changed. A whole bunch of pulmonary docs retired and a whole bunch of new ones showed up, right? So you know, the old story, you don't really change the way a doctor practices medicine, you just wait for them to leave, right? And that was really part of the evidence-based medicine proved that. It takes about 16, 18 years to change physician behavior, and that's really the bulk of their career. So you got, you know, there were a whole bunch of requirements that required detailed chart notes and documentation. And if they really didn't need oxygen, I don't think they were going to do it. So I think that marginal patient that they might have prescribed, they chose not to. The LOT study that took a look at the population of people that were normoxic based on current standards during the day. They put them on oxygen. They did a long-term longitudinal look to see if it changed anything, and it unfortunately had no impact at all on hospitalizations, on mortality. So they concluded that you know, unless you had severe hypoxemia, you weren't getting any benefit, even if you were very mild, like a 90, 91. And obviously, lastly, you know, like I said, physician practices can change as we've learned about, you know, between the rules, the education, things like the LOT study influencing this population, when the NOT study out of the 70s influenced the whole other generation of physicians. And then, just from a technology standpoint, I think liquid isn't ever making a comeback, and I don't say that because I don't like it. Like I said, I like horses, but I don't ride one every day. It logistically is just impossible to do cost effectively. There's no economy of scale. You really don't get any economy of scale. POCs are going to continue to grow. They are popular. They're getting better from a technological standpoint. And I think that'll be the trend that we see from a technology standpoint as we continue to get better access to new motor technologies and chip technologies and sieve technologies. So that's really it. You know, I kind of covered everything. I think that I still believe that despite all those challenges and problems and ups and downs and lack of good clarity and stuff, it's still an incredibly important part of it, of the provision of respiratory therapy and the transition of patients from hospital to home. And I think that hopefully, if any good comes out of this pandemic, it's that they recognize the role of respiratory and oxygen and the importance of transitioning those patients early and the overall cost benefit it gives. So if they gave a little more money on the home care side, it would save a whole lot of money on the other side. So, and that's why I say payment systems need to be realigned so that we're really lining up to what's valued. And that's it. So thank you very, very, very much for allowing me to take time.
I was just thinking about the data on how much oxygen at night and how it went down. There was a time when OSA patients could get oxygen at night, and then they get dropped at the emergency, so that might be a factor.
Yeah, I think I mentioned, I do believe that had some impact, that, you know, people were being treated with oxygen for OSA, they were probably OSA patients. So that clearly is probably a subset for sure. Anything else?
Joe's going to be around this week, another talk later on today. So again, thank you, Joe. It was very important.